In an authoritarian mini rant at a press conference earlier today, Donald Trump doubled down on his ongoing and ever escalating war of censorship against media networks that he doesn't like, specifically the Associated Press, saying that he will continue to limit their access to him and the White House unless they agree to use language that he likes. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. Folks, we've continued to cover Donald Trump's ongoing war of censorship against the media, and it has multiple fronts, multiple theaters. In this case, this is an update on his grudge, his beef with the Associated Press, which is a news agency that is represented all over the world. I mean, as big as their footprint is here in the United States, they are truly a global news agency, and that's their rationale for not using his renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, because the rest of the world doesn't recognize it, and they are not simply a domestic news agency, they are a global news agency. Trump was asked about this at a press conference earlier today, and he doubled down on his open censorship.
Take for you to reconsider the restrictions on the Associated Press, and secondly, some of your advisors are concerned with the Associated Press's style guide, using language and giving guidance to not use words like illegal immigrant or to use phrases like gender-affirming care, and they're concerned about that being an encroaching amount of liberalism in the way in which the press writes about things. Do you share those concerns?
Well, I do think that some of the phrases that they want to use are ridiculous, and I think, frankly, they become obsolete, especially in the last 3 weeks, because many things have happened in the last 3 weeks, and I didn't know about that, but I would say that if they want to use certain phrases like that, and I guess some are okay, but many aren't, but the Associated Press just refuses to go with what the law is and what is taking place. It's called the Gulf of America now. It's not called the Gulf of Mexico any longer. I have the right to do it, just like we have the right to do Mount McKinley, and nobody's even challenging that. But only the essentially, it's primarily the Associated Press, and I don't know what they're doing, but I just say that we're going to keep them out until such time as they agree that it's the Gulf of America. We're very proud of this country, and we want it to be the Gulf of America. Now,
So there's a lot wrong with what he said, of course, because he's an idiot and a liar and an authoritarian, just a couple of things. The reason that nobody's freaking out or challenging him about Denali being renamed, because it was originally Mount McKinley, named after President McKinley, who is apparently the only other president that Donald Trump is aware of because somebody happened to mention it in front of him, whatever. The reason that nobody's pushing back on that is because Mount McKinley is within the geographical United States. We don't share it with any other country, okay? It is ours as a country. So if the federal government wants to rename and redesignate Denali and back to Mount McKinley, they have every right to do it. And yeah, the Associated Press isn't fighting that. The Gulf of Mexico, on the other hand, is a body of water that is shared it's not owned by the United States. It's shared with other countries, including Mexico. And because the rest of the world doesn't agree with the Trump administration's redesignation, the rest of the world, for the most part, has just kept Gulf of Mexico. That's the tradition. That's the globally recognized name. That's why the Associated Press is pushing back on this. But even the language that he uses, he's like, I have every right to do it. He's just making it about him. They're not following what the law is. What law are they breaking? He can't cite it. None of his acolytes and sycophants can cite it either. There's no law that requires any media. I should clarify this. There is no law that requires any media organization or any journalist or any commentator, myself included, to refer to the Gulf of Mexico by the Gulf of America. We're not obligated to do so. That would be an egregious violation of the First Amendment, in addition to the egregious violation of the First Amendment that Trump is already employing by doing what he's doing with the Associated Press. Again, he's just so stupid and authoritarian. He doesn't get it. But a Trump White House personnel, Taylor Budawick, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff and Cabinet Secretary, this is what he had to say just a few days ago. The Associated Press continues to ignore the lawful geographic name change of the Gulf. He says the Gulf of America. This decision is not just divisive, but it also exposes the Associated Press's commitment to misinformation. While their right to irresponsible and dishonest reporting is protected by the First Amendment, it does not ensure their privilege of unfettered access to limited spaces, like the Oval Office or Air Force One. Going forward, that space will now be opened up to the many thousands of reporters who have been barred from covering these intimate areas of the administration, Associated Press journalists and photographers will retain their credentials to the White House complex. But here's the thing. You are openly, you're admitting it, you're not hinting at it, you've just said it, and you said it multiple times. You're targeting the Associated Press specifically because of this. No one is saying that every journalist or every media organization, including illustrious media organizations, have the right to unfettered access to the president. But you are specifically singling them out because they're not using language you like, right? That's why, like, at-will employment, right? If you're an at-will employee, you're working in an at-will state, you still can't fire somebody because they're black, right? There are still protections, worker protections. You can fire somebody for most reasons or no reason at all, but you can't actually specifically target people based on things that would violate other areas of the law. It's kind of the same thing here. If he just randomly decided not to let the Associated Press in because it's limited access and there's not enough room, most people wouldn't be freaking out about it. But he has specifically targeted them for partisan political reasons. Brian Stelter of CNN has been on this like a hawk, and this is what he had to say recently about the Trump administration's war against the Associated Press.
What are you hearing about how the AP is responding to this?
Right. On Tuesday, we wondered if this was a one-time thing, a one-off, but it wasn't. This is now a standoff between the AP and the Trump White House. It's something the AP didn't ask for. It's just trying to report the news for a global audience. And because the AP broadcasts and writes around the world, it has to acknowledge that other countries don't call it the Gulf of America. So they're sticking with the Gulf of Mexico while also acknowledging Trump's executive order. We're going to see other global news outlets take the same position, and that could cause further standoffs with the Trump White House. But for now, it's the AP and the crosshairs. And here's what executive editor Julie Pace
I'll finish this.
Said last night when the AP was blocked, not just from a Oval Office photo op, but from a presidential news conference. Pace saying it's a plain violation of the First Amendment, and we urge the Trump administration in the strongest terms to stop this practice. She has described this as viewpoint discrimination, punishing a news outlet for its editorial choices, and that foreshadows a legal challenge. I expect the AP will probably go to court to challenge this in the days to come.
What do you hear?
And they should. They really should. Now, of course, who knows what the disposition will be if it makes its way to the Supreme Court. There are some Supreme Court justices that want to roll back the landmark Supreme Court case Times v. Sullivan and make it, which is a major bulwark against defamation and other First Amendment practices as well. It could potentially leave news agencies and newspapers more vulnerable to pushback or retaliation from the Trump administration. But again, it's just Stelter's been all over this. You should definitely follow him on Twitter if you haven't. Overnight, I heard from editors and reporters. This is 6 days ago. We've had subsequent statements since then, who wondered if the administration will next penalize news outlets and acknowledge the existence of transgender people or cite data from purged government databases. Because again, this is important too. Right now, it's the Gulf of Mexico. Well, the Trump administration also takes the position that trans people aren't real. So what happens if you report about trans people, or if you acknowledge pronouns or gender identities of trans people? Will that get you kicked out of the White House? I mean, where does it end? There seems to be no limiting principle here, and it seems to be really an opening salvo for Trump to punish the press, which he campaigned on. Let's be clear. Donald Trump is the most openly censorious political candidate in modern American history. There is no Democrat that comes close. You probably put all the Democrats together, and they have still said a fraction of the unhinged shit about the media that Trump has. He's openly talked about suing them, suing reporters, suing journalists for defamation and libel, and pulling them off the airwaves and punishing them with DOJ investigations and FCC investigations. And you'll recall, as we've discussed, because again, this is a multi-pronged war, Trump's FCC has been egregiously weaponized against media that has been critical of Trump, while also bending over backwards to cover media that's been friendly to Trump, like Fox News. And again, even like this notion, the Associated Press engages in misinformation. Well, let's grant the premise. We're not going to because it's bullshit, but let's grant the premise. You still lose the debate because by that logic, Fox should be kicked out of the White House forever because, again, they had to pay $787 million, the single biggest defamation settlement in the history of the United States. So they are objectively more inclined to misinform and be partisan and be dishonest and less journalistically credible than CNN, the Associated Press, or MSNBC. So, and again, as I've said before, it might take a Democrat coming in, winning the election, and kicking out conservative media just to make the point. I hope it doesn't come to that, but maybe a gloves-off approach is the only way to get through to these people. Now, the organization FIRE, which is a libertarian free speech organization, they've also been all over this. They have taken a principled stance. calling out the Trump administration for this encroachment on free speech rights. As we said for the past 3 days, punishing journalists for not adopting state-mandated terminology is viewpoint discrimination and an attack on press freedom. The role of our free press is to hold those in power accountable, not to act as their mouthpiece. And as another pointed out, most of the people supporting this would have rightfully, vigorously objected to a journalist being punished by a government official for saying Fort Bragg or Mount McKinley during the last administration. Again, a great point. Remember, the military base Fort Bragg, which has since been renamed back to Fort Bragg, was called Fort Liberty, renamed Fort Liberty by President Biden. And yes, it would be like kicking Fox or OAN or whatever out of the White House, Newsmax, because they refer to it as Fort Bragg instead of Fort Liberty. That never happened. It just didn't happen. I'll also point out that Fire also has some pretty good articles about this as well. White House barring AP from press events violates the First Amendment. The widening gulf has opened between the Trump administration and the Associated Press. Which gulf, precisely? On Tuesday, the AP said the White House blocked one of its reporters from attending an event in the Oval Office, blah, blah, blah. And again, it goes through kind of the history of this. In a letter to White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, AP editor Julie Pace called the administration's actions viewpoint discrimination based on a news organization's editorial choices and a clear violation of the First Amendment. She's right. To be sure, the First Amendment does not require the White House to open its doors to the media or hold press conferences, nor does the president have to do a one-on-one interview with CNN just because he did one with Fox News. The court decisions spanning decades make clear that once the government grants media access, it has to play by constitutional rules. That doesn't mean the White House has to allow every reporter into the world into the Oval Office or briefing room. Space constraints obviously make that impossible, and not every journalist will manage to secure a press pass. But the reason for denying access matters. When the government shuts out journalists explicitly because it dislikes their reporting or political views, that violates the First Amendment. It does. The Trump administration has been openly censorious in this respect. They have waged a concerted effort to crack down on media that they don't like, commensurate with Trump's campaign. And for people who say that they're conservative free speech warriors, you should be outraged by what the Trump administration is doing and what Trump just doubled down on. But unfortunately, all too many have just been silent because it was never about free speech principles. It was about owning the libs. And if that means you have to be a hypocrite to do so, so be it. Pretty disgusting, and it's ongoing, and we're only 4 weeks in. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.